The spirit of Ronald Reagan is alive and well in the Labour Party cabinet. They seek peace by preparing for war. If you want peace, you should prepare for peace.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and Australia's foreign and security policy is marked by intense secrecy, and the AUKUS agreement is the epitome of this practice. It was sprung on the Australian people overnight without any consultation. Scott Morrison didn't even take it to Cabinet. And despite the eye-watering price tag of at least $368 billion and the serious doubt about whether it will actually deliver Australia any submarines, the deal has still not been subject to any serious parliamentary or democratic scrutiny. But the tide is turning against AUKUS. Public support is slipping. According to Australia Institute polling, less than half of Australians think the deal will make the country safer. And against the backdrop of an increasingly violent and authoritarian Trump administration, there's a growing chorus of voices calling for Australia to rethink AUKUS.
You enter into a deal with the United States where it is a part of the deal that there is a circumstance where you will not get the submarines you think you're getting.
What's remarkable about AUKUS is it was signed up without even a formal cabinet brief. It was signed up without any kind of serious scrutiny, either from within defence or within the Parliament.
The UK's had an inquiry into AUKUS. The US is currently holding its own inquiry into AUKUS.
It's poor governance that we have not had our own parliamentary inquiry into this.
It's got this aroma of something that's about to cave in on itself.
When you say to the Australian government, OK, what happens if in fact you don't get any submarines? What's your plan B? They just say, there's no need for plan B.
Doug Cameron is part of that chorus. He's a former Labor Senator for New South Wales, former National Secretary of the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, and a national patron of Labour Against War. He spoke about AUKUS and the Australia-America relationship at this year's Laurie Carmichael Lecture, an initiative of the Australia Institute's Centre for Future Work, Carmichael Centre. Delivered on Wednesday, the 10th of September at Victorian Trades Hall Council, Doug called for greater parliamentary oversight of defence and foreign policy and for the Australian government to announce their intention to end AUKUS. What follows is an edited version of the address. To watch the video of the full event, you can find it at the Centre for Future Work website. We'll leave a link to that in the show notes. Here's Doug.
At a time when powerful domestic and international forces dominate the debate on the future of our defence capabilities, it's timely to critically analyse Australia's political and industrial capitulation to militarism and warmongering, disguised as defending Australia. Our parliamentarians have engaged in a combination of wrong-headed and dangerous political decisions with little transparency and even less accountability. The Albanese government remains deeply invested in AUKUS. The UK has dreams of a new AUKUS-class submarine at a time when its construction facilities and workforce are in decline. If the Dreamboat follows the downward trajectory of Astute and Vanguard and Dreadnought, it will never materialise. Foreign-influenced security think tanks, usually funded by defence industry companies that stand to make huge profits out of Australia's naivety, have been dedicated to justifying profligate government expenditure on nuclear-powered attack submarines, the design of which is predicated on defending against nuclear attacks by states with nuclear weapons. These submarines will lock us into the warlike activities of nuclear weapon states. This totally defeats any disarmament or arms control logic. It's a complete repudiation of decades of Australian anti-nuclear weapons policy. Labor is junking its own policy heritage. The mainstream media is determined to shape public debate in support of AUKUS, in support of militarism. Some try-hard academics spend their intellectual capital on justifying increased military expenditure at the expense of building a good society. Together, they are a great threat to our sovereignty and our peaceful existence. An example of the media's determination to attack, marginalise and delegitimise those who seek to improve dialogue with China is the hysterical response to Bob Carr and Dan Andrews' attendance at the Chinese celebrations to mark Japan's defeat in World War II 80 years ago. The Sydney Morning Herald linked Andrews with Putin and Kim, while describing them as pariahs in the West due to the war in Ukraine and Kim's nuclear ambitions. They've never heard of the United States, these people. Andrews is the politician that the media loves to hate. He kept on winning elections. However, this tells us that the voters thought more of him than they did of the media. Something's wrong here, and it's not the voters. The Conservative-aligned media seem only to know about backing losers. Surely we should be advocating for a deeper bilateral engagement with China. We cannot deal with the rise of China by ignoring it. Rather, we need to talk to China seriously and often. It would have been appropriate, and in my view in the national interest, for ministers to attend the celebration in recognition of the importance of the defeat of Japan and diplomacy in avoiding future wars. Even Tony Abbott sent a minister to previous Chinese celebrations to mark the Japanese defeat. Too many of our current parliamentarians have no experience and even less idea of the horrors inflicted on working class people when diplomacy and peace give way to war. The peoples of Palestine and Ukraine and now Qatar show us the horrors of war every day. As a child growing up in the 50s in Scotland, Aussie accent, but I'm from Scotland, I witnessed the devastation that the Second World War brought on my family, my father, and thousands of physically and mentally scarred working class returned soldiers. It will be working class families and their communities who pay the price as mind-boggling amounts of public funds are expended on subsidising the US and UK military industrial complexes. Too many Australian politicians have capitulated to the rhetoric and myth of peace through strength and promulgated the lie that militarism and the increasingly unreliable US alliance will make us safer. History demonstrates that this is naive and partisan nonsense. The sentiments of President Franklin D. Roosevelt in his I Hate War speech of the 14th of August, 1936, should be at the front of mind of every Australian politician. Roosevelt said, and I quote,
I have seen war. I have seen war on land and sea.
I have seen blood running from the wounded. I have seen men coughing out their gassed lungs. I have seen the dead in the mud. I have seen cities destroyed. I have seen 200 limping, exhausted men come out of line, the survivors of a regiment of 1,000 that went forward 48 hours before. I have seen children starving. I have seen the agony of mothers and wives. I hate war.
Surely we need American presidents with those sentiments. Shortly after Roosevelt's death, the United States ruthlessly unleashed atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I have been to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park and Museum. The Hiroshima Museum tells a bleak and horrifying story of inhumanity and the implications of nuclear war. Many security analysts have legitimate fears that military containment and confrontation of China will lead to nuclear war. I do not understand what has happened to my party, the Australian Labor Party. I do not understand why a party with a long history of anti-nuclear activism can abandon its integrity, its history, and its credibility by capitulating to militarism within 24 hours of learning about the AUKUS deal. Why would we expose our nation, our communities, to becoming nuclear targets in order to support US military adventurism in pursuit of hegemony in a war that it can never win? And even if it could win, why would we support the mega deaths such a victory would entail? Why are we abandoning the principle of peace in a desperate effort to hopefully obtain second-hand nuclear-powered submarines decades from now? Why are we pouring billions of dollars into the construction of a submarine base in Western Australia to accommodate American nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed submarines in defiance of the long-held practice of keeping nuclear weapons off of Australian soil? Not one cabinet minister will concede this truth. The Trump regime and the US military have no compunction in asserting that the military build-up in our region is to constrain and deter China. There was no justification for the then Albanese opposition to have put their quest for the government benches before the party's long-standing opposition to nuclear weapons and its principled quest for peace. In my opinion, the Australian electorate would have supported them, whether they adopted AUKUS or not. There was no need to abandon the Labour Party's enduring principles. This was an unnecessary and politically inept capitulation. AUKUS, along with the Force Posture Agreement, diminishes our sovereignty and increases the likelihood that we will be dragged into a war with China over Taiwan. I never thought that the party of Chifley, Evatt, Whitlam, Keating, Crean, Uren, Cairns, Murphy and Evans would abandon our sovereignty to the United States. I am even more bewildered that the Labour Party, with such a massive majority in Parliament, would resort to word games about having undertaken a serious review of AUKUS and why so many of my former colleagues have been muted, intimidated and acquiescent. Where are the peace activists in the Labour caucus. More to the point, where are the local members working to look after the well-being and prosperity of their electorates, while billions are poured into the pockets of weapons manufacturers, lobbyists, and former politicians? Why have the ministers who once marched shoulder to shoulder with Tom Uren at Palm Sunday peace marches abandoned their principles? Why have those on the left of the party rejected common sense and long-held values to fall in line and support US hegemony and imperialism? Why have progressive parliamentarians and activists who have a history and culture of organising and campaigning and marching against US military aggression in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan and Iran lost their voice, lost their courage and lost their commitment? Why has the Left Caucus failed to uphold its historic role for peace? Why are they missing in action on AUKUS, Palestine and US support for Netanyahu? Why has the Left Caucus failed to support Keating, Carr, Evans and even Malcolm Turnbull in their opposition to AUKUS? Why are they deaf to the ever-increasing evidence that AUKUS and the Forced Posture Agreement are not in Australia's interest and increase the potential for devastating nuclear conflict? Why has the parliamentary left allowed themselves to be defanged and co-opted into supporting US military aggression? Caucus solidarity must never come before opposition to war, genocide, and starvation of innocent civilians in Gaza. You would be aware that opposition to AUKUS is growing within the ALP rank and file and its branches. I was intrigued to read the Ross Gittins article of the 3rd of September in the Sydney Morning Herald, where he says, "These days, there's no great ideological divide between Labour's left and right factions. As one of the left's luminaries explained to me, these days, they're just rival management teams." Surely, the left leadership must see itself as more than part of the management team. Surely, the left must articulate and fight for the progressive policies and the principles that the rank and file of the party who elect them to Parliament elected them there to pursue. Labour Against War, of which I am a joint patron with former Labour Minister Margaret Reynolds, has been a focus for rank and file members to discuss their concerns and opposition to AUKUS and to the Forced Posture Agreement. At the recent Victorian State Conference, delegates voted consistent with Labour Against War policy to call on the party to establish an independent parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS with full terms of reference. The conference called on the government to suspend participation in AUKUS and the funding of US shipyards pending the outcome of the inquiry. This was despite frenzied opposition to the resolutions from ministerial offices and Albo's left Praetorian Guard. Left must be in. It is dangerous when the parliamentary executive becomes increasingly out of touch with the party rank and file. This disconnect between the executive and rank and file will continue to grow as the leadership concedes our sovereignty by deeper integration into the US war machine. How crazy is it that our government ignores a basic human right to housing, champions market-based solutions and home ownership, while disregarding the lessons of the past that public housing and a housing commission is a proven solution to unaffordable housing for working class Australians. At the very time the availability of social housing is declining, under the Force Posture Agreement, Australia is funding public housing for United States Armed Forces personnel in Western Australia. How crazy is this? It's militarism gone mad. America is attempting to build countervailing regional groups such as the Quad and AUKUS to contain China and to maintain US military and geopolitical superiority. And isn't this going well?
Russia's Vladimir Putin and India's Narendra Modi were among those to join China's Xi Jinping for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Jointly representing over 3 billion people and militaries over 4.5 million strong, standing shoulder to shoulder, laughing, smiling.
China is eager for it to take a larger role on the global stage in a possible challenge to US dominance.
Offering financial support, encouraging partnerships in lunar exploration, and committing to cooperation over AI development.
It could have major ramifications for the U.S., especially with India frustrated over President Trump's new tariffs.
There's Modi and Putin taking a nice stroll in Beijing with President Xi as Trump creates a world that is the antithesis of the American dream. We must ensure that we never become a United States proxy in a war with China. Look at the implications and devastation in Ukraine as the US and Europe and NATO increasingly fund the Ukrainian military. If my party were genuine in the pursuit of order, stability and peace, we would not be funding the US and UK military-industrial complex. If we were genuine in pursuing peace, we would be increasing our diplomacy, seeking compromise and accommodations, and arguing that there can be no winners in a conflict with China that could lead to the use of weapons of mass destruction. It's time that we stop the simplistic claptrap promoted by the Labour cabinet and promulgated by its defence ministers that deterring war through strength promotes peace. While we are offering a bit of corrective therapy, it's about time that the government stopped hawking the defence industry as a job-creating programme. It's not. It's a job-swapping programme at best and a job destruction programme at worst, as investment in the arms race crowds out genuinely productive and socially beneficial manufacturing investment in areas such as modular housing, transport systems, and advanced manufacturing. We must be more sophisticated, analytical, and truthful when it comes to our relationship with the United States. The rules-based international order that our government is so eager to promote is not an inclusive order created for the benefit of humanity. It does not mean a peaceful and harmonious system. It's about power politics by procedural means. It entrenches the power of the powerful and is designed to exclude and subdue their rivals. The global south continues to live on the edge. So when government leadership waxes lyrical about the rules-based order, and the need to deter war through strength, take note of America's continued failure in that regard. Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University has closely analysed what he describes as an abiding failure of American culture. He shows that almost every modern US military intervention in the developing world has come to what he describes as rot. He said it's hard to think of an exception since the Korean War. In the 1960s and first half of the 1970s, the US fought in Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, eventually withdrawing in defeat after decades of grotesque carnage. These were resounding examples of the futility of peace through strength. He references Chile in 1973. General Pinochet's murderous military junta overthrew Salvador Allende with US backing, and how the US installed dictators throughout Latin America and parts of Africa with disastrous consequences that lasted for decades. The US installed the Mobutu dictatorship in the Democratic Republic of the Congo after the CIA-backed assassination of Patrice Lumumba in 1961. In the 1980s, the US under Ronald Reagan ravaged Central America in proxy wars to forestall or topple leftist governments. The tradition continues with attempts to destabilize the progressive Lula government in Brazil. The Middle East, Western Asia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Libya, and the US-led Gulf War in 1992 are further examples of the futility of subjugating ourselves to militarism. It is beyond belief that our political leadership could tie us so unequivocally to the US, given its history of aggression, intervention, and destabilization that has resulted in its own humiliation and defeat. I hope the US AUKUS review saves us from ourselves. I never thought that the ALP National Conference delegates who expressed genuine, legitimate concerns about AUKUS would be attacked on the conference floor by a left-wing minister parroting Ronald Reagan, who at the 17th of July 1980 in the Republican National Convention, he said this:
"We know only too well that war comes not when the forces of freedom are strong. It is when they are weak that tyrants are tempted."
To hear a Labour minister morph into an Antipodean clone of Ronald Reagan, trumpeting strength deters war, appeasement invites conflict, is more than disappointing. It's a denial of the left's long pro-peace tradition. This is such a simplistic, stupid, and wrong-headed analysis. Warmongering is in fashion. Just last week, in a crazy act of homage to the dogs of war, Peter Hegseth was renamed Secretary for War. In May this year, Hegseth said the region, the Indo-Pacific, is America's priority, and the threat posed by China is real and potentially imminent. Well, those AUKUS submarines are going to help us if that's the case. Australia's Defence Minister described this as a very clear articulation of American intent that what they seek is peace through strength. Former comrade of mine, by the way. The spirit of Ronald Reagan is alive and well in the Labour Party cabinet. What this really means, as that they seek peace by preparing for war. Just because some long-dead Roman thought it was a clever thing to say doesn't make it true. It just proves that stupidity has ancient roots. If you want peace, you should prepare for peace, not war. The Australian Defence Minister also described AUKUS as moving beyond interoperability.
We will move beyond interoperability to interchangeability, and we will ensure we have all the enablers in place to operate seamlessly together at speed.
Against whom? China. Does anyone really believe that in these circumstances our sovereignty will be protected and Australian military chiefs will be dictating the strategy? Does anyone in my party understand that the US cannot defeat China in a conventional war? Has anyone in my party read Malcolm Fraser's 2014 book, Dangerous Allies, where he, of all people, with great foresight, articulated the contemporary issues that face our nation now in its relationship with China and the United States? Fraser argued against the Menzies formulation of depending on great and powerful friends. He preempted our current dilemma and called for a rethink of the culture of strategic dependence on the USA. He argued that the United States would not have the capabilities or the determination to defeat China, and that if Australia allied ourselves with the US, they would eventually retreat back to mainland America. We would be left defeated allies in a region dominated by China. That is provided the world is not destroyed in a nuclear Armageddon. What has happened to my party? Where is the courage to do as Simon Crean did at the National Press Club in Canberra on the 20th of March 2003, when against fierce political and media support for the invasion, he opposed John Howard sending troops to Iraq? Simon Crean gave the following assurance to the Australian people. He said this: 1. As Prime Minister, I will never allow our policy to be determined by another country. 2. I will never commit to an unnecessary war while peace is possible. 3. And I will never send Australia's young men and women to war without telling them the truth. These are enduring principles that should be adopted by the Albanese government. In addition to this, Labour should publicly declare that it is not in Australia's national interest to engage in a war with China over Taiwan. Should take urgent steps to identify alternatives to AUKUS and the Force Posture Agreement. Give notice to the United States and the United Kingdom of our intention to end AUKUS and the Force Posture Agreement. Ensure that we have genuine parliamentary oversight of the defence and security intelligence services. And given the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security is toothless, has no capacity to oversight defence or security activities, as in other comparable democracies, the PJCIS powers must be urgently and significantly enhanced. The Parliament should oversight, not anyone else. We should legislate for a parliamentary debate and determination prior to any declaration to have our military engage in conflict. We should establish and fund a national peace research institute to operate in parallel with the Diplomatic Academy at the Department of Foreign Affairs and the National Security College at the ANU. And while we're at it, we should change the title of the ludicrously named Australian War College in the Department of Defence back to the Australian Defence College. We should conduct a parliamentary inquiry into the implications of the revolving door of former parliamentarians, advisors, public service and military personnel being employed by companies and institutions funded by or part of the global military industrial complex. Come to think of this, we should apply it to the mining industry as well. We should legislate to prescribe former parliamentarians, advisors, public servants and military personnel for being employed by arms manufacturers for a period of 5 years after they have left the Commonwealth payroll. We should take steps to increase the density and complexity of our research, science and manufacturing sector, with a view to improving our defence capacities and widening our industrial base. We should reduce our dependence on US military equipment and technology that can be turned off at the flick of a button by the United States. We should increase political and diplomatic engagement with Asian Pacific nations and particularly China. We should require the ABC to ensure commentators on defence issues divulge any conflict of interest, funding from or employment within the military-industrial complex. Any such conflicts would be announced prior to appearances on ABC News or current affair programmes. In conclusion, and in the Carmichael tradition, I call on Labour parliamentarians, the trade union movement, rank-and-file activists and the public to educate themselves about the madness that is AUKUS. Organise against militarism, build a campaign in support of peace, diplomacy and common sense. Let's stop the warmongering and build a good society.
Thanks very much for joining us for this episode of Follow the Money. If you want more transparency around AUKUS, you can sign our petition calling for a parliamentary inquiry into the deal. And if you want to explore the Australia-United States relationship in more detail, you can tune in to Dr. Emma Shortis's weekly podcast, After America, or purchase her Vantage Point essay of the same name. It's available for just $19.95, or you can become a subscriber to the Vantage Point essay series and save $15 a year. Links for all of these are in the show notes. This year's Carmichael Lecture was delivered on Wednesday the 10th of September at the Victorian Trades Hall. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.